Shall we open our Bibles this morning to Mark 14, verse 66? Mark 14, 66, as we continue with Mark through the gospel account that he is given by the Lord through Peter. Peter actually led Mark to the Lord and told him all that Jesus had done. Mark was a young guy by the time that the Lord was here. For the past couple of weeks, we've been looking at the passion of our Lord in terms of what took place that Thursday moving into Friday morning. And we saw the Lord's arrest there in the garden a couple of weeks ago when Judas showed up with what could have easily been 1,000 people, making sure that they weren't going to lose the Lord. And Jesus quickly convinced them otherwise. He's the one that would go willingly with them. So he knocked them all down. They had to get them up and clean themselves up. And he went with them to give his life for our sin. All of the gospel accounts go out of their way to say to us, they didn't take him, he went. In fact, you will read as you read through these trials that he goes through during the night, that every time they move him, they bind him, as if somehow they could hold him. But the only thing that held him there was you, and his love for you and for me. So the Lord was taken, the boys fled, the Bible tells us. They ran for their lives, they forsook him. And Jesus was taken off to what would become 6 trials through the night, over several hours. By 6 o'clock in the morning, Pilate would send Jesus off to be crucified. By 9 a.m., he would be on the cross for 6 hours. But there were 3 religious trials before Caiaphas and Annas, his father first actually, then Caiaphas, and then in the morning the Sanhedrin, who wanted to give formal charges to Rome to try to have him killed. And then before Pilate, and then Herod, who Pilate tried to dump the responsibility on, and Herod wasn't having it, and back to Pilate he would go. We looked at the first couple of trials last Sunday morning. They were all designed, at least the religious ones, to find charges. Annas was the godfather. He ran the high priest office as a crook. They took advantage of the people. They made them pay for sacrifices and changed their coins. And the Lord hated it because the people came to worship him and they ran into these guys. But Rome didn't like Annas, but the people respected his position. So they took him first to Annas, who asked Jesus to testify against himself, tell him about his disciples. He wouldn't do it. And so they said, well, what about your doctrine? And Jesus said, well, wait a minute, this isn't the way you run a court. Go get some witnesses. I didn't speak privately, I spoke publicly. So bring them in here, they'll tell you what I said. And the soldier standing by Jesus slapped him across the face and said, that's disrespectful. And Jesus said, if I'd said something wrong, tell me what it is. But if not, what are you doing hitting me? Annas wasn't very successful in getting charges. He sent him across the hall in the same palace. They lived together in this place of rulership. And Caiaphas had brought in a bunch of other priests and all. And they began to question Jesus and to bring in false witnesses. They couldn't even get 2 of them to agree together. Even in the middle of the night, lying through their teeth, they couldn't get the story straight. Finally, one of them said that, Jesus said, destroy this temple, and in 3 days I'll raise it up. But that didn't seem to go well either, because there couldn't be 2 folks that even could agree as what he said. Finally, Caiaphas reached for what he knew Jesus would affirm. He said, are you the Christ? Are you the Son of God? Are you God? And Jesus didn't hesitate to say, I am. I am that person who is coming. I'm the promised one, which led to a severe beating at the hands of Caiaphas's men. And they, in their frustration, wailed away at him. And Caiaphas said, well, we don't need any witnesses. You heard it from his own mouth. Well, he didn't have any witnesses. But they wrote this down, that he was an idolater, a blasphemer. And so while all of this is going on upstairs, there in the hall, if you will, outside in the court, down below in the courtyard, the Lord records for us what we want to look at in 7 verses this morning, the struggle of Peter under great duress, who had made some huge promises to the Lord and now was vowing to keep them. He had said to the Lord at dinner, these guys might forsake you. I would die for you. I don't know where you're going, but I want to go with you. And Peter had shot off his mouth a lot. He'd done it out of love. He said that his devotion was unparalleled, that his loyalty could not be questioned. He believed it was beyond even the disciples that were with him. And we get to find out that that wasn't so. Now, I'm sure you know the story. It is recorded in all 4 Gospels, and I'm always interested when the Lord puts the same story in all 4 Gospels. That doesn't happen that often, especially when you try to mix John in, who tells stories from an entirely different perspective, picks different things. But the Lord puts these in all 4 of them, and I guess I'm interested most in Mark's account because this is Peter's testimony. This is Peter saying to Mark, and then I got to tell you what happened. And he has to kind of lay it out for him. So we want to just look from verse 67 to verse 72 this morning. I know that it is the story of man's failure as he tries to make promises. For me, it is the story of God's faithfulness. Because as poor as we can come through, as failing as we often are, God doesn't give up on us. And I hope that you know that this morning if you're here and you're feeling like, man, I've really let the Lord down or I haven't been doing very well. God is good at starting over with us. And he can take the likes of Peter, who was filled with Peter, and empty him out and fill him with his strength and his power. We suspect that as the arrest took place at the garden, that there was a lot of panic. You know, mobs tend to do crazy things. And there was blood in the air, so to speak. They'd gotten Jesus. It wouldn't have been any different for them to grab some of his disciples who now took off and fled. But we know from the gospel accounts that Peter and John followed the procession of Jesus across the Kidron and up the other side into the temple area and then over to where Caiaphas and Annas lived. And they followed him over to the high priest's residence. We are told in John that John the apostle was led into the residence, that he knew the high priest. We have no idea what his relationship with him was or how that took place. We know from history that fish delicacies from the Galilee were the foods of the rich and the wealthy, importing them. John was in that business. We know that John had a house in town that he took Mary to later on that evening as the Lord gave the care for his mother to John. But beyond that, we don't know how that relationship was established. We also know that Peter needed John's help to get into the courtyard, into the courtyard. That Peter showed up a little bit later. That I think the words that Luke uses are, he followed them afar off. Mark uses in verse 54 that he followed Jesus at a distance, that he arrived a little bit later. John writes in chapter 18, you know, the first question becomes, what are you doing here, Peter? And the answer is, living up to my word, right? I had made some pretty bold declarations. I want to prove my commitment. I mean, Jesus had been betrayed by Judas. 9 guys had hit the pavement, were running for their lives. John somehow, knows somebody and is inside, and Peter stands off alone and gets to the gate, and he was led in with John's help into that place. That's all that we know. But there are a lot of people like Peter, and I think, one of the issues that we have to, learn from this is that if you're going to try to follow the Lord afar off or at a distance, you're going to not succeed very well. That's a horrible place to be with Jesus. I know people like that. Maybe you do too. They're interested in the Lord. They're interested in church. They're interested in God's people. They just don't want to really get too close, right? They want to claim to believe in him. They'll even make promises of loyalty to him. But they live lives that are greatly distanced from his will. And yet they're church people. And they're around. They will not cast a vote for Jesus publicly. Their relationship is kind of at an arm's length. They won't vote for him. They'll talk to you about, I love him in my own way. But they won't confess him outwardly. They won't live for him inwardly. And like Peter, they're doomed to failure because you can't live that way in relationship. You don't have that kind of relationship with God any more than you should have that relationship with your family or with your wife, your husband. But Peter was way back. He was in the shadows. He was, for all of his talk, he wasn't right up there with the Lord, certainly. We are told in verse 66 that as Peter was below in the courtyard, one of the servant girls of the high priest came, and when she saw Peter warming himself, she looked at him and she said, you also were with Jesus of Nazareth. But he denied it, and he said, I neither know nor understand what you're saying. And he went off to the porch and the rooster crowed. If we put all of the gospel accounts together, the question from this young girl tending the gate was asked as Peter came in, as she led him in, and he went over to stand by the fire to get warm with the officers and the priests, John tells us. And it was a cold night, and so he kind of got up to where the fire was, and Luke says they were sitting around the fire. The picture's it's kind of awkward, isn't it? I mean, here's a man of God sitting around the world's fire trying to get warm and fitting right in. It's not a good place to be. It isn't a place that I would say, sit by the world's fires, you get burned. But here's Peter. On the one hand, he's here to prove his loyalty. On the other hand, he wants to be anonymous, right? On the one hand, I will die for you. On the other hand, he wants to be comfortable where he's at. He wants to escape notice. He wants to fit in. And if you're a Christian this morning that goes out of church after 45 minutes and then goes back to the world to fit in, you're going to break God's heart. And you're going to break your own heart. It doesn't work that way. Why would we want to hide his love for us from anyone? But here's Peter, at this point, following afar off, and then coming into the door and wanting to somehow fit right in, right? No one would recognize him. It's a path of compromise. It isn't a place that he's going to feel comfortable for long. And you have to believe that sitting around that fire, the talk was, hey, we did what we came to do, didn't we? He thought he was going to get away. We had to take all those people. We could have just done it with a few of us. Maybe the talk was, I wonder how we all fell down. That was weird. But in the end, we got our man, right? And he's upstairs taking a beating. And we're down here having done a good job. And so that's where Peter is standing. Now, Luke tells us in chapter 22, verse 56, that this young girl who had let him in sat across and began to intently stare at him. The kind of stare that says, I think I know you. Studying his face, kind of taking a good look. The word intently means to gaze with interest and with a purpose. The question that she asks in Greek is posed negatively. It literally reads, "You're not one of those, are you?" And it literally, it conveys contempt. This woman didn't like one of those. You're not one of them, are you? And she turns to Peter. It expects a no answer, but it showed her attitude towards Jesus and to those who would follow him. And Peter, as a man of great promise, all of a sudden is put on the defensive by this young girl sitting at the gate, whose only job is to open it up and let people in or out. He feels exposed and vulnerable. The thing is, her phrasing of the question gave him an easy out. All he had to do is say, nope, I don't know what you're talking about. It facilitated his plan to kind of go unnoticed, if you will. A question of contempt, but yet, she let him off the hook, so to speak. But here's the deal. If you follow Jesus far off, you're not going to be able to stand for him when asked. You're not going to have much strength. You're going to be put off pretty quickly. You're going to be stumbled readily by the world. And notice in verse 68 that Peter, as he denies knowing anything about what she's saying or has no knowledge of this Jesus of Nazareth, that he gets away from the fire and stands by the porch. And as he's moving, from the light into the darker place, if you will, and away from the crowds, the rooster crowed. Not exactly a subtle reminder of what the Lord had said back in chapter 14, verse 30. Peter had made a promise, and the Lord had said, well, I'll tell you what, before the rooster crows twice, you'll have denied me 3 times. Before the morning, you'll have taken your stand against me, not with me. And Peter hadn't heard it and believed it. It does appear from all that we have in the Gospels that the Roman soldiers, that cohorts, the 600 men, if you will, the 10th of a legion, had gone back to their barracks on the other side of the Temple Mount. And if that is so, then Peter is left standing amongst a very hostile crowd. These are friends and family and servants of the high priest himself. So he's not in a company that's going to be for him. But he just says, I don't know what you're talking about. And notice he sneaks off into the dark. He doesn't want to be recognized, so he moves himself away from fire pit, and he stands where there's less people and probably a little colder and certainly a little darker, and he hides over there. Now the rooster, sounds off, and Peter might go, oh, that's one. No, I'm fine over here. And rather than leaving, he's just going to see these things through. We read in verse 69 that, and the servant girls saw him once again and began to speak to him, began to speak to those who were standing by and saying, "This is one of them," but he denied it again. Luke tells us that some time passed by and that this servant girl came to accuse him and really to point out that he was one of Jesus' men. Not asking a question, making an accusation. Hiding in the dark hadn't worked. Maybe Peter felt comfortable after a while and went back to the fire, which would make sense. But this time, her words are loud enough to prompt others to question Jesus. In fact, John says, because of her words, that the folks around them said to Peter, "You're not one of them, are you?" And he defiantly said, "I'm not." Now, this isn't the same girl that was at the gate. In fact, John goes out of his way to tell us, no, not John. Matthew goes out of the way to tell us it was another servant girl, or different from the first girl. So now, there's a stir going on. He's recognized at the gate as he's let in, recognized now by somebody else. And this girl isn't asking, she's asserting, "You're one of them. You belong to the group." Those standing around are moved to ask. The heat is turned up. The crowd is inquisitive. They've had a victory tonight. They've removed that Jesus. To get one of his disciples again, that would be even better. So there's hostility and suspicion, and hiding never works, and now Peter panics. Jesus had said, Satan wants to, sift you like wheat, Peter. He's after you, but I've prayed for you. When you're converted, you can go and strengthen the brethren. He told Peter this was coming. He told Peter he could get through this. But Peter hadn't believed any of it. And rather than getting better, this was just getting worse. So here's Peter following from a distance, who's left weak in his witness and weak in his influence. You'll read in Acts chapter 4 of Peter that they took notice of him, that he'd been with Jesus, and they saw great boldness in his life. You don't find that here. Peter is detached enough from the Lord and pretty much convinced of Peter that he's not willing to hear anything negative about his devotion to the Lord. And so Peter answers very quickly. He just said, "No, I don't belong to him. I'm none of his." And one denial kind of leads to the second, and the hounds of hell, they hunt in packs, I suspect, although I don't know, that the first time Peter denied the Lord was harder. I know that it's like that in sin. The first time you do the wrong thing, you're guilty, you know it, you wish you hadn't done it, and oh my gosh, what am I thinking? But the second time is much easier, I've been down this road, I've done this before. It isn't as bad as I thought that it would be. And I suspect that this second denial was a little bit easier than the first. Sin has a way of eroding, your defenses, right? There's less resistance. I always think about Lot, who, he sees the land of the plains. He chooses to go towards Sodom. He builds his house, if you will, facing it. Eventually, he moves into the city of Sodom. His life is one of losing everything precious to him because he lived there, and then he could barely get out of there. He had to be dragged out because he loved it so much. That's kind of the way sin has to go. You have to get dragged, along, and pretty soon your decisions are not good anymore. They're not even clear because you've kind of made the choices along the way. Matthew says in chapter 26 that Peter, in this second oath, swore with an oath that he hadn't been with him. The word swear with an oath literally means just that. I swear to God I don't know God. I swear to God I don't know him. That's pretty much what it amounted to. He curses himself from the standpoint of making sure that if you're not going to believe me, let me just swear to God. Let me just add his name to the mix. Well, then we read in verse 70 after the denial, and a little later there was one who stood by Peter again and said, "Surely you are one of them. You're a Galilean. Your speech shows it. And he began to curse and to swear, I don't know this man of whom you speak. And the second time the rooster crowed. Luke tells us it was an hour between number 2 and 3. Why Peter stayed, I don't know. All that I can tell you is he was very proud of himself, and he's made it this far, and he's going to show the Lord who he can see up there and, on the second floor on the courtyard up there, being tried and all. He can hear, he knows what's going on. The Lord's going to see that I'm here for him. And even though he's denied him twice, he hasn't gone that third step, if you will. And so he hangs there. He's convinced that he's in the clear. Everything was okay. No one got hurt. I fooled them now. I can get on with why I'm here to begin with. No more questioning. He leaves me alone. And then an hour later, this third challenge comes. And I don't doubt but that it's a shock to Peter. I thought we got through this. Oh, no, not again. And if you want to make it worse, John chapter 18, I think it's verse 26, says that the person raising their voice was a relative to Malchus, the high priest's servant, who Peter had just cut his ear off there in the garden. It was somebody that was related to Malchus. And so I don't know if it was a guy or a girl, but they went, hey, that guy hurt Uncle Malchus. That's the guy with the sword right there. And the accusation came from one who had been in the garden, had seen what had happened. And Luke writes the words, they confidently affirmed it, or literally, they swore it. No, that's you. There's no doubt here. You're one of them. You're a Galilean. You got that Galilean accent. And the verb tense would say, they didn't say it once. They kept saying it. No, that's him. I'm telling you, that's him. That's him. That's him. That's him. I saw him. That's him. And you can just watch Peter go, uh-oh, I'm in a little trouble now. And he wasn't in doubt. He was accusatory and loud, and the crowd began to all look again at Peter, and the accusations began to be more, on point, if you will, and the mob mentality was looking more dangerous. And I think that Peter was genuinely afraid. He's in over his head now. We read here in verse 71 that he began to curse and to swear. And I know if you read that, you want to think he's using swear word. Neither one of those words would mean that. But it does speak about a severe oath that you would take, maybe along the lines of, may God strike me dead if I'm lying. I mean, he elicits God's involvement, swearing that he didn't belong to Jesus. Now, if you read Matthew's account in chapter 26, you will see the comparison, because as Jesus is one floor up in Caiaphas's hearing chamber, if you will, judgment hall, Jesus is up here saying, I'm God, and getting beat for it, while Peter is down here saying, I don't have any idea who he is. One is affirming, and it's costing him plenty. The other is denying and trying to get away. The obvious question in reading the story was, what happened to Peter, and how did he get here? And I think the answers are found in the story itself. For one thing, Peter has great self-confidence, and that's not a good quality when you're a Christian. I'm not saying you shouldn't be confident in God's work in you, but you shouldn't be confident in you. And it's a quality that the world has for sure. But Peter is the epitome of a guy, with all that he says leading up to this point, that is just really self-confident. I think he would say things to Jesus like, hey, I'm Rocky. You called me that yourself. Because that's what his name meant. I'm Rocky. I can handle it. I'm sure the music started, and he charged up the stairs, and just to show Jesus who he was. They might fall, but I won't fall. They might forsake you. I'll never forsake you. I will die for you. And now he's swearing, may the Lord kill me if I'm lying. He's gone a long way from where he should be. Paul will write to the Corinthians in chapter 12 years later, be careful, those of you that think you're standing, lest you fall. There's a difficulty in walking with God for all of us that allows us to think we can just do this on our own. And it's dumb to do that. It's a dumb thought. I know we do it because that's how the world works. I'll do my best. I'll put out, all the effort. You're going to see how it matters to me. And yet, when it comes to spiritual things, you're done. You're cooked. Peter, Satan has asked for you, but I've prayed for you. That's his hope, that Jesus will intercede for Peter and get him through this. But that evening, as Jesus even challenged these guys, Jesus said to them all 2 hours earlier, 3 hours earlier, 4 hours earlier, without me, you can do nothing. John 15:5. And Peter went, that's probably true for most of those guys, but not for me. Haven't you ever read the Bible and it doesn't doesn't apply to you? Now, everyone else would apply it to you, but you won't. You'll apply it to you. I've had people say, oh, I wish my Uncle Jerry was here today for that message. And I'm thinking, well, what did you get out of it? I'm thinking Uncle Jerry needs this. You just deflect, right? Not for me. I don't need it. Uncle Jerry needs it. No matter how strong you think you are, how committed you feel, Jesus is right. Without him, you can do nothing. And some situation is going to come up in your life where your strength, like Peter's, is going to be insufficient. We have to learn, if God's going to use us, we have to learn to rely heavily upon his grace, which is a never-ending resource. Right? In the book of Proverbs, I think chapter 16, I guess, it says, pride goes before destruction, right? A haughty spirit before a fall. And unless you didn't get that in verse 18 of chapter 16, he repeats it 8 verses later in chapter 16, verse 25. It says it twice in the same proverb. Hey, by the way, you're going to be ruined by your pride. It'll take you out. One thing that you find in Peter's life that you should take to heart is if you're going to serve the Lord in your own strength, you're going to fail. He's going to fail. Second of all, if you go back in the story, at least as Peter is brought here, Peter was sleeping when he should have been praying. The Lord had taken him into the garden and he had said, Peter, come and watch and pray with me for an hour that you don't enter into temptation. Peter, yeah, good night, Lord. No, just stay awake with me. Well, yeah, I got it. And he was out. Never prepared himself for what now lieth before. Wasn't hanging on to the Father, wasn't looking to heaven for help. While Jesus was struggling with intense prayer that caused him to sweat great drops of blood because of what he is about to face, Peter didn't feel he needed to prepare himself for anything. And God dependence will overthrow self-confidence, but if you have great self-confidence, your prayer life's probably pretty minimal. Because what do? Pray to yourself? Give yourself a high five? You don't need much help. Thirdly, Peter follows the Lord afar off. That's real hard. It's hard to go where the Lord is going when you're lagging that far behind. Jesus said, follow me. He no doubt meant the closer, the better. Because the minute you get far behind, you lose sight of him. Things get dark. Life closes in. You become isolated. You don't have defenses. And, you get the picture. Following afar off is a bad idea. If you're here, if your life with the Lord amounts to this service, and if you get out of here in the three minutes you hope I'm finished, and I probably will be, if that's it, that's not much to run with. That's this far. Your Bible goes in the trunk so you'll know where it is for next Sunday. Not helpful. Not close. Not practicing what you're learning. And finally, look, Peter blends in with the world. He wants to be anonymous. His relationship with the Lord is kind of distinct from his relationship with the world. He wants to fit in out there and stand apart in here. And that doesn't work. Blessed is the man who doesn't walk in the counsel of the ungodly. Blessed is the man who doesn't stand in the way of sinners. Blessed is the man who doesn't sit in the seat of the scornful. Blessed is the guy who's come out of the world differently than the world around him. And once away from the Lord, the pressure from the crowd to fit in will be strong. It's difficult to follow Jesus when your very presence with him says you're not following him. It's hard to speak up for him when your life in the world says, I'm part of you guys. We read in verse 72 that as the second rooster crowed, that Peter called to mind the words that Jesus had said to him, before the rooster crows twice, you will deny me 3 times. And when he had thought about it, he wept. Mark tells us one of the immediate responses of Peter hearing that rooster crow again as he is cursing and swearing. And by the way, if you read Luke's account, it would seem that as Peter is making the swearing, I swear to God, may he strike me dead. He gets interrupted by the rooster, which Talk about swallowing your words. I think this would have been horrible, right? He hadn't listened to what Jesus had said, but look at what it says in verse 42. He thinks about it now. Oh, man. Now the word of God, which he had been given at a time of peace, he now brings to mind at a time of terrible suffering. And he had promised undying allegiance, and here he was swearing he didn't even know him. But it gets worse, because in Luke chapter 22, it says that Peter then, at that point, looked up, and he saw Jesus looking down at him. Maybe he looked to say, did you hear that, rooster? Oh, yep, you heard it. And the Lord's face bloodied. Go back and read how Caiaphas' men had beaten him and covered his head as they beat him around the head. This bloody face of the Lord looking down at Peter. And Peter, I swear to God I didn't. And the rooster crowed. Can you imagine? Gives you goosebumps, doesn't it? I mean, oh my goodness. And it says that he went away and wept. Luke writes the words, he wept bitterly, ashamed of his sin, hurt over letting the Lord down. Now, I can't tell you what Jesus' eyes would have said if they were still able to focus on Peter, if they weren't, bloodied and swollen. But I'll guarantee you his look, if you can communicate by your face, did not say, you rat. I think more to the point, the Lord would have said, I know you. I know, and I love you. And you're going to get through this, and, without a word. I think the look from Jesus to Peter got him through the next 3 days. I really do. I think beyond that, I don't know where he could have turned, because Jesus would die in a few hours. Peter didn't have a chance to get to him to apologize or somehow to try to make it right or explain what he meant. That death kind of seemed to close the door for all of that at all. And so all he had to go on with what he saw and then what Jesus had told him. I've prayed for you, and when you're converted, I'm going to use your life. It's okay, Peter. I know your heart. I know your frame. I know what the enemy wants. I'm going to see you through this. I think sometimes we expect a lot more of ourselves than God does, because we have a false concept of what we can do. And so we're hard on ourselves when the Lord would tell us, I'll be your strength. I mean, Peter, had great pride, but it's not very helpful here. I think that the time between here and the resurrection on Sunday morning must have been most miserable for him. I don't know how he got through it, except to remind himself of Jesus' word and to play into his mind again the mercy that he saw in his eyes. 3 days from now, Jesus will rise from the dead, and one of the in fact, it's in Mark here in chapter 16. One of the accounts were that as some of the girls came to the tomb, that there was an angel there. And the angel reminded the ladies that, you remember when he was with you, that he said he was going to go before you into Galilee? Well, go tell the disciples that, and be sure you tell Peter. And Peter gets singled out by name, that he was the one that the Lord wanted to say to, I'm alive, I'm going to meet with you. This isn't the end of things between you and I. And in John 21, before the Lord goes to heaven, he in front of Peter's peers, asks Peter 3 different times in 3 different ways, do you love me? And Peter said, yeah, I love you. And then the Lord asked him again, he said, all right, you know I love you, but you really know everything about me. So he wasn't even willing to now say, I love you and you can believe it. He was just willing to say, you know me. You know I love you to the best of my ability. I don't know. I can't make any promises now. And the Lord said, then you can feed my sheep and feed my lambs and tend to them. And he puts him back in ministry because, our failures don't negate God's ability to use us. And Peter's the guy that stands up on Pentecost and preaches, and thousands of people get saved. In fact, in Acts chapter 4, Peter gets arrested for preaching. And guess where they bring him for his trial? Into the same courtyard. Except it's a different Peter here. Now you read of, they took notice of him and his boldness that he'd been with Jesus. And Peter gives this great testimony in Acts chapter 4, led by the Holy Spirit upon his life. And God begins to use Peter in a mighty way. But now Peter's learned that the Lord's his strength. You can sum up these 6 verses in 3 little statements. Peter stood at the world's fire, and he came under fire, but eventually he was on fire. It just depends where you're standing. and who you're looking to. I think if you want the Lord to use you mightily, stay close. Don't be too confident in you. Paul was able to say, when I'm weak, then I'm strong, so I'm really happy that I'm weak. So he could be strong in me. And be sure that you don't turn away from what he said to you. Don't blend in the word with the world. I'm not ashamed of his love. Are you? I'm glad he loves me. I can't explain why. That's the hard part. But I'll enjoy it nonetheless. Father, we thank you this morning as we sit together that Peter is a living example of somebody, I guess, that we're all kind of like. And that we make promises we can't keep. We, like most folks, feel that we have lots to offer to you that you need, and that our strength is sufficient for so many things. And we realize that when it comes to our salvation, and as well as our walking and serving you, that's absolutely untrue. It isn't our strength. We're weak. Sin made us weak. We're dependent upon the Spirit in our lives to enable and to form our hearts and to give us doors that would be open. And Peter, Lord, all that we can gather from the Gospels, made a lot of these errors because he was sure he wanted to display his love in this way. But his error was he didn't listen. Didn't listen to what you said about him. Didn't agree with your assessment of his heart, of his capabilities. Took a stand in his strength, grabbed a sword, took a swing, showed up at the high priest in the midst of turmoil and a mob, and nearly got himself killed because he just didn't agree about your assessment of his heart. And yet, a few weeks later, he gets it just fine. Lord, that you might show us that we are weak, but without you we can do nothing, but with you we can do all things. And that our hope this morning will be in your work, that we'll pray more, we'll follow close behind, we'll stay right where you're at, we'll do as you say, we'll give weight to your words, and you'll use us in a mighty way. And look, if you're here in church this morning, you've been away from the Lord, or at best you're following afar off, you're on the fringes. That's not a good place to be. Let the Lord bring you closer to the fire that comes from his love. Move you away from the world's kind of counterfeit fires and come to Jesus. And let him warm you and encourage you and use you. He can do great things. We can pray for you this morning. A lot of our pastors will be up front. If you don't know Jesus personally, come and tell them that. And let them talk to you about how you can be saved this morning and be born again. Because that's what God wants to do in your life. That's why he came. Peter's a pretty good example of what we're like and yet what God can do in the lives of those who look to him. Shall we stand together this morning?